His Excellency Hamad Massadeh, who's former ambassador of Jordan to the EU, Belgium, Luxembourg, Norway, that's quite a list, and NATO, as well as former Secretary General for the Union of the Mediterranean and Minister for Public Sector Reforms. So excellent fit considering what we're going to discuss here today. And last but by no means least, we've got Ms. Rim Momtaz, who is currently a research fellow with the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and also an Emmy Award-winning journalist. So I've asked each speaker, in terms of the rules of the game, to begin with initial remarks of some 10 to 11, hopefully no more, minutes. After that, we'll switch into discussion mode. I may kick off with a number of follow-up questions for each of the speakers, and then we'll open it up and collect as many comments and questions you may have. There's also an internet feed, so we'll also get some questions and comments from an online audience, hopefully in the tens of thousands who are following us here today, because this is being streamed live. So we're going to start with Javier and a view from NATO, a more official view from NATO, given that he's the DASG. A pleasure to have him here in Alicante. So Javier, it'd be great if you could give us a sense of what you think are the main takeaways of the Madrid summit and the strategic concept, and also perhaps take stock of where we are today, 3 to 4 months after the concept was approved, and what NATO's main political and strategic priorities are. And perhaps you can also, if there is time, if not, we can do that later, tell us a bit how the South fits into NATO's strategic vision. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Luis, and thanks very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to me, for me to be in Spain and in Alicante. Casa Mediterráneo is hosting this roundtable, and I'm very pleased to be here. So, as we all know, the summit in Madrid was going to be historical anyway, but because we were going to adopt from the very beginning the strategic concept, and that makes every summit a historical occasion. But in this case, it was a landmark summit for different reasons, basically for Russia's war against Ukraine when it started on February 24. That has changed European security architecture, but also international relations at large. Probably the most immediate and historical decision that impacted the summit because of that was the historical decision by Finland and Sweden to decide to join NATO. So there were, I would say, 3 sets of decisions that were fundamental. First, and there are marking actually the priorities that were that I see as the main things to do for NATO in the next months. First, on Ukraine, that was the main decision, and that is the main priority, to continue to sustain Ukraine. We're doing that in a 2-track approach. On the one side, bilaterally, allies are helping, sustaining financially and with military equipment Ukraine as much as they can. And on the other side, multilaterally, NATO is supporting Ukraine with the means we have, non-military and non-lethal aid that we are providing, actually quite substantive in terms of equipment, in terms of support, anti-drone support, in terms of CBRN support. So we're doing plenty of things as well, but at the same time trying to be very responsible. I always like to say that, in my view, what NATO is doing is probably fulfilling the most important task in 70 years, which is actually to be extremely responsible to prevent that a local war, as terrible as it is, doesn't become a global one. And that takes me actually to the second set of decisions, the one on defense and deterrence. We decided to actually increase our presence in the East. We doubled the number of battalions that we had from 4 to 8. We increased the ability to scale up those battalions to the brigade level. And at the same time, we changed the way we generate the force. We created what we call the new force model. Basically, it is an increased visibility on our forces and an increased readiness on our forces. Just to give you an example, a couple of figures. In the first couple of weeks after February 24th, NATO was able to mobilize 40,000 troops 300 aircrafts and 100 ships. It is quite remarkable in just 15 days. With the new force model that we are implementing, we will be able to do in those same 15, 20 days, 300,000 troops. So it is quite a change, and it will give us the ability to respond to whatever threat and challenge come to us. And the third big decision that actually encompasses the ones I mentioned is actually the strategic concept. The approval of the strategic concept that, as I said, was supposed to take place in Madrid, and we started to work on it before the war started, but it was very impacted by the fact that the war started. So it maintains the three core tasks as we know them: defense and deterrence, crisis management, and cooperative security. But it also goes into the strategic, the most strategic questions for NATO, the geostrategic competition as such, which is right now in front of us at every level, how we will deal with China in the future, how we are approaching Russia. Right now, it's clearly an adversarial relation, and the only thing we could do is to isolate Russia until the moment they decided to stop the war and withdraw their troops. And we also talked about the South, and that is where the South came into play. And I would say there are two dimensions of the strategic concepts that apply to the South. First, there is a clear conceptual base of the strategic concept that actually started with NATO 2030 process when Jens Stoltenberg, our Secretary General, launched that initiative, which is at the basis of everything we've been doing the last 2 years. We need our partners to confront better the challenges and threats that are common to all of us. And in that philosophical change, we need then to go deeper in our partnerships to make them stronger in a two-way street. It should be beneficial for both of us. Our partners should be, as I say in many occasions in a colloquial way, our eyes in the region. But we need to use our partners not just to involve them in a few initiatives, but to have them from the very beginning and take decisions, taking into account their own positions on the ground, since they know better than we do the challenges and threats that are common to all of us, but are coming from that region. So how we go deeper in our partnerships will be the first one. The second one is the challenges and threats, and strategic concept mentions those. The most immediate threat and the only other threat apart from Russia that is accepted and agreed as a threat within NATO is terrorism. But then there are other challenges, from climate change and security to irregular migration or illicit traffics. All of them are mentioned in the strategic concept. It is the first strategic concept that mentions the Sahel as a region of particular concern and importance for NATO. It was only at the end of 2020 when we started to talk about the Sahel with a foreign minister's report. Then it went into being mentioned in the communique of Brussels 2021 summit, and then it went into the strategic concept, giving us a sort of a roadmap in the next years, and we were able actually to approve a defense capacity building package with Mauritania in Madrid. So I would say that those two dimensions, how we work on the partnerships and how we work with our partners to confront those threats and challenges, will be the basics of how the strategic concept is incorporating MENA into our thinking.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Javier, for such a sweeping overview of the Madrid strategic concept and the South in general. Already, we're going to dive into the South. You've talked a lot about partnerships and the centrality of partnerships in everything NATO does in the South and in NATO's approach to the South. So speaking about that, I think we're now going to move on to the ambassador to get actually a partner perspective. So Ambassador, it'd be grateful if you could tell us a bit about how the security situation in the Middle East and North Africa is seen from a partner perspective, and in particular from Jordan. But also, if you could give us a sense of how NATO's role is perceived in the region, but also perhaps also that of other countries that NATO labels as strategic competitors, such as Russia or China, whom we know are very present in the region. Welcome to Alicante, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And again, I thank NATO for inviting me for this very important session. It's very symbolic that we are sitting in Alicante, in the middle of the Mediterranean. And this stresses the point that cooperation is very important across the rims of the Mediterranean. Indeed, we're sitting within the context of NATO, yet the Mediterranean dialogue has been one of the most important tools, from my experience as a former ambassador in Brussels, to foster and augment cooperation relations in the region. And I know that the mindset and the policies of NATO are different to those very much related to the Mediterranean, yet I do believe that the Mediterranean dialogue within NATO shouldn't always be looked at as one of the important tools to foster cooperation. Now, my dear friend, Mr. Khafir said, I'm very happy to hear about the strategic concept, and then you said that we want the partners, our partners in the South, to be our eyes in this partnership. Yet we have always to remember that in order to have a solid partnership, the interest of these partners should be taken into consideration, and their needs in the region. And I think that the security issue, and security, I'm using the word in a very broad term, whether it was pure security or whether it was a human security, is very important, in addition to the geopolitical security of the region, which we have always been, as Arab countries in the South, calling for to be looked at in the context of our interests with our, if I may say, Western Hemisphere friends. We had security challenges over the past 3-4 years, actually probably more, starting from ISIS and terrorism, and I think that we worked as Arab countries very well with our partners in NATO and in the EU on this matter. Then we had the pandemic, which was again it raised other security issues. And of course, we had the issue of human and narcotic and drug trafficking, illegal trafficking, which is also hitting countries like Libya, Syria. Actually, it's imposing threats to our security in general in the region. But then now we have the issue of the Ukraine crisis, which obviously has its impact on the security of the region. And in this context, we have to look at threats in the region in the form of 3 forms. First of all, probably it is an economic threat. Secondly, it is a political threat. And thirdly, it is a geopolitical threat. If I take the economic part, which is very important for Arab countries, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has hit hard on food security in the region. In addition to oil and gas prices, in addition to the issues of employment. And now these are social and economic issues, but they have a political impact. For instance, if you take into consideration a country like Egypt, which imports 85% of its wheat from Ukraine and Russia. Lebanon, which imports its wheat also, 95% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, in addition to other countries. Now, the moment that you see that that there is a shortage of food and products, the moment that you see that the prices are skyrocketing for families in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in other Arab countries, and then you see that governments will have to intervene with subsidies or from its budgets, unless that these issues are not tackled in a proper way, probably they could lead to political unrest. And so if we have political unrest, we don't want to go back to seeing people on the streets because of economic crisis. And this eventually will affect the region and eventually will affect NATO and the EU because of the interrelationship that we have together. On the political level, I do not believe that the Ukraine crisis has forged a new realignment, political realignment. However, the Arab countries' position vis-à-vis the Ukraine crisis it can be looked at as sitting on the fence and watching. And let's buy time. Probably I can say that it is like we would like to appease a friend in Moscow, but not at the expense of partners in Washington and Brussels. So it is a matter of buying time to see where this thing leads. So basically Arab countries are hedging their bets on this situation. However, I believe that the more the crisis in Ukraine becomes longer, the options and choices for Arab countries to stay with this policy will become very difficult, and they have to take choices. And as you see, probably the official line of Arab countries was to condemn the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, but at the same time, they kept relations going with Russia. For instance, Saudi Arabia is very important because they are, for the last few years, they are establishing arms deals with Russia and with China. So basically also they don't want to lose that. This also applies to Egypt in particular, who signed with Russia, I think 3-4 years ago, an agreement to establish a nuclear plant in addition to other arms deals. So basically it's a bit tricky. However, for Arab countries, they would like to maintain this relationship with Moscow, but not at the expense of Washington or Brussels. Probably last security threat, which is a geopolitical one. I mean, there are many there. In Libya, there is a geopolitical threat. In Syria, there is one. In Iraq. But I will probably talk about two issues in this context: the Palestinian issue and the Iranian issue. The Arabs for decades have been telling our Western partners that the Palestinian issue should be settled, and that the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land should end. Because this is a cornerstone in building trust and building cooperation. With all due respect, it seems to me that our European partners and the United States have never seen that a war might happen in their own backyard. And so Palestinians and Arabs in general, for sure, could relate to the misery of Ukrainians, because they've been under siege for 7 decades. They could relate to aircrafts bringing buildings to the ground. They could relate to displacement with the Ukrainians, because they have suffered this for 7 decades now, 70 years, without a solution. However, there is mixed feeling among the people in the Arab region about the swiftness of NATO and the EU and the international community in condemning Russian aggressions against Ukrainians, when at the same time they look away when it comes, or they looked away when it comes to the Palestinian calls that have always been calling for condemnation of Israeli aggression. So the point is that I'm trying to say here that if we want to forge proper and strategic partnership, it has to be built on trust and taking the interest of the southern partners into consideration. One of the most important now issues and strategic issues for Jordan, of course, and for the Palestinians, is that we have to have a solution for the Israeli-Palestinian issue on the basis of establishing a Palestinian state on the 1967 lands, occupied lands. And I can dwell on this more probably through the Q&A. The other issue is the Iranian issue. Now, as you all know, the leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, banned Iranian diplomats or officials from dealing with the United States in the past years, especially in the nuclear deal. So Russia was playing the intermediary role in this context. Now, the more NATO and the West places pressure on Russia, I would assume that Russia would be reluctant in pursuing any intermediary role between the Western Hemisphere and between Iran on the nuclear negotiations. And this could raise risks in the region. Because for Saudi Arabia and for other Arab countries and for Israel, the Iranian nuclear file is a strategic file and very worrying. And it is, we've always known that the Israeli officials have threatened that if there is no nuclear deal on the Iranian side, they could escalate militarily and they could intervene. And that could bring the region into more escalations. And so we have security threats in this context. In addition to this, I believe that probably Russia at this point does not have an interest in signing or in forging a nuclear deal, because if this is going to lead to lifting the sanctions on Iran, especially in terms of Iranian oil, this could mitigate the sanctions or the effect of the sanctions on Russian oil. And so basically Russia does not have an interest at this point in pushing forward with an Iranian deal. Now, the Iranian file, in my point of view, continues to pose a threat and security issue. So the main geopolitical files that maybe we need to look at is the Palestinian issue and is the Iranian issue. I'm not saying that the Libyan is not important, it's very important. The Turkish, of course, they have a lot of interest there. The Syrian is also very important, but I think that mainly speaking, we have to look at it from the 30,000 feet level, at the level of the Iranian and the Palestinian issue. And of course, from the social level, we have to look at the food security and supply chain issues.
Excellent. Ambassador, thanks for that terrific intro. You put a lot of big ticket items on the table. I'm sure we'll come back to many of them, including the Iranian file, which, as you know, presents a clear element of linkage with what's going on in Ukraine. And with Russia, you also provided a sort of more expansive definition of security and actually mentioned the EU. We'll also come back to that later because there's quite a lot going on in terms of NATO-EU relations. So perhaps Javier can tell us more about that during the second round. But let's now get an independent and a prolific researcher pitch in on this. Rem, it's a pleasure to have you with us here today. How do you see the security and the geopolitical situation in the MENA region evolving, and what do you think are the main challenges and opportunities, perhaps, going forward?
Thank you for having me. I think my two co-panelists have gone over a lot of the main points, so I will be brief and hopefully we'll have a good Q&A. There's no doubt that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has definitely also had very important security effects on the MENA region. But it's been very interesting to see that in the public discourse in the MENA region, the challenges posed by and that are the direct results of the Russian invasion of a sovereign nation, Ukraine, are not actually tied to Russia that way. So the food insecurity, really gigantic issues that are coming up for Arab countries in the general mindset is not tied directly to the Russian war. And that is a point that perhaps Western nations should look at more closely. The same applies to the energy challenge. And here I'm talking more of obviously about MENA than the GCC countries. There is also a little bit of Schadenfreude when it comes to the way the Arab world has been looking at how Europe in particular has had to reckon with the return of real high-intensity war on its continent. You know, there are those who spent 8 years and more now, 10 years, following and covering the war in Syria, where Russia has played an extremely destructive role, where it has committed war crimes since 2015 in Syria against an Arab people, where no matter how often people who worked on Syria raised the alarm about the need for Russia to be contained and countered when it comes to Syria, we saw the choice that was made by whether it's the US in 2013 and President Obama refusing to enforce his own red line, and as a result the UK and France unable to do anything independently from the US. That is definitely in the back of people's minds because a lot of the methods that Russia is using in Ukraine, down to the Air Force general who is now leading the Russian operations in Ukraine, well, he led some of the Russian operations in Syria and tried a lot of the methods that they are now using, namely aerial bombings of civilian infrastructure. They are now using it in Ukraine. So that's one of the reasons why you see little sympathy or solidarity in parts of the Arab world, in addition to what the ambassador said about Palestine, no doubt. But there is no doubt that Russia and its actions in Ukraine have definitely introduced more insecurity, are a security challenge for the countries of the MENA region. And that is perhaps not something that is perceived as such by the countries in the MENA region. Some of them have long-standing relationships with Russia, going back to the Cold War, of course, and some of them want to use their good relations with Russia while maintaining good relations with Western countries to hedge their bets, to give themselves more leverage. And by the way, that is what countries that know how to use their own leverage do. This is what every other country does. And that is something that perhaps Western nations are best advised to take into consideration and not try to force the Arab countries to choose between them and Russia, or not to give them lessons about that, because they won't find open ears for that. But beyond what Russia is doing in Ukraine and its malign effects on MENA, there are obvious issues and challenges in the Mediterranean as such that if we just take the Mediterranean region and look at Middle Eastern and North African countries, there are real challenges there. Terrorism continues to be a real issue, whether it's because of Libya, but not just because of Libya. Syria continues to be a main issue. The Palestinian conflict continues to be a conflict that inspires terrorism. Clearly, there are issues when it comes to maritime security and conflicts between countries over energy resources, whether it's Turkey and Greece, but also Cyprus. Libya is involved with that. These are real issues that are have their sources and origins in the region, and that need to be dealt with in the region. There's also been a proliferation of minilaterals, and one of the things that we saw over the past few years is, for example, Morocco joining the Abraham Accords, and that has had that has destabilized the relationship with Algeria, and so there has been a resurgence of tensions between Algeria and Morocco. That too in itself is a factor of instability, undoubtedly. And then there are what we call the threat multipliers, climate change. Just the past year, we saw how drought and extremely high temperatures during the summer have had an extremely detrimental effect on the stability in the region. These are possibly explosive issues moving forward. It has an effect on water security, which is already a challenge for a lot of the countries in the region. And of course, it has an effect on food security, which is already affected, as we were just discussing, by the Russia war in Ukraine. So as we can see, there is not a dearth of crises and threats in the region, both now with the addition of Europe being a factor of instability for the region, and the region's own issues continuing to be factors of instability. And I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rim. So now I'm going to ruthlessly abuse my position as moderator to ask a couple of follow-on questions before opening it up. Rim, I think you made a very clear point about how there are a wide range of long-standing challenges in the region, in the socio-economic front, energy front, security front, that transcend the war in Ukraine, right? Having said that, I think it'd be great if you could say a bit more about Russia's presence in the region today. We know that Russia has a number of important relationships with some countries in the region, particularly Northern Africa, and I know you've been working on this. So it'd be great if you could unpack that a bit more, and maybe you can also go into a bit more depth into on a subject that you've touched on already, which is the security and geopolitical situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. How do you see that going forward?
Right, so very easy and uncomplicated questions. To talk about Russia, I mean, it's, Russia's presence in the MENA region is one that is multifaceted. It has a real hard military presence that it gained with its involvement in the Syrian war. So now it has a very strong foothold in the Mediterranean with both a military port in Tartus in Syria, but also an airbase, Hmeimim, that it uses not only for its intervention in Syria, but also as a projecting point. Right before the war in Ukraine, Russia deployed a reinforced naval fleet into the Mediterranean. It was part of its deterrent activities ahead of its war in Ukraine, and so we see that the Mediterranean is absolutely a part of Russia's how Russia practices its power and projects its power. It even sent a nuclear submarine into the Mediterranean in recent months. It has also been able to continue to benefit from its historic relations, as I was saying, dating back to the Cold War, with partners in the region. So at the beginning of this month, actually, Russia was able to maintain and carry out naval exercises with Algeria. Russia and Algeria will also be carrying out counterterrorism exercises. And we see that that partnership continues to exist because it benefits Algeria. Egypt, of course, continues to have good relations with Russia. Russia is building a nuclear power plant in Egypt, which is essential, by the way, for Egyptian electricity and power needs. And that is something that also needs to be taken into consideration when assessing why these countries continue to maintain these relations. Russia is, of course, also using malign activities like influence in the region, and it has been able to leverage media organizations such as Russia Today in Arabic or Sputnik in Arabic that somehow evade the marker that companies like CNN or the BBC or France 24 have, which are seen as arms of Western state messaging, whereas for some reason RT Arabic or Sputnik Arabic isn't seen as such. In the Arab world, they are seen as reliable, credible, mainstream media organizations, which obviously they are not. So that is a real challenge because these media organizations have definitely been pushing a certain narrative when it comes to what is happening in Ukraine, for example, saying that Russia was pushed into a corner by NATO and by the US, that the US provoked this war, and that Russia is just merely responding. And that kind of narrative has had a lot of traction in the Arab world. So, these are two of the fundamental ways, for example, Russia practices its power in the region, and of course we cannot forget when it comes to the Gulf, OPEC Plus and Russia leveraging its oil reserves and the fragility and the upheaval in the market that, of course, GCC countries need to keep calm for their own economic and infrastructure needs, which, as we've seen lately, has led to a lot of tension with the US because the US administration doesn't seem to really want to take that into consideration, or at least when it comes to its public messaging. When it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean, there's been a lot of developments over the past couple of years that are really game changers. To start with the mini-laterals, we've seen, for example, Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt form a mini-lateral because they have overlapping interests and they have a same perception of threat in the Mediterranean. That, of course, has upset Turkey. As Turkey has been more assertive over the past few years in the Mediterranean, as it has, for example, made deals with Libya with MOUs and sent hydrocarbon drill ships into the region. That is one major development. Greece is growing more assertive. It has made some security deals with France, for example, that has a security guarantee. That is changing the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The same with the US. They have upgraded their security deal with the US. And Greece has asked for a raft of weapons, whether it's French Rafales or frigates, and is asking the US to modernize its F-16 fleets, and is even asking for F-35s. So that is definitely something to bear in mind. We saw over the past few months a lot of tension just in terms of a war of words between Turkish public statements and Greek reactions. So that is something to obviously keep in mind. We also saw that Lebanon and Israel just reached a maritime demarcation deal. It's very early days. They signed it yesterday, so unclear whether both parties will be able to respect it and put it in place. That is something that is obviously one to keep in mind as well. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And you made a few references to the U.S. As many of you may know, the National Defense Strategy was released yesterday, and there are quite a few references about right-sizing the U.S. defense posture in the Middle East. Perhaps we can go back to that later on. But Ambassador, I wanted to come back to you. You were talking earlier about the fact that many countries in the region are hedging their bets in relation to Ukraine / the relationship with Russia, but also about the fact that such hedging might be increasingly difficult to maintain in the future. So perhaps if we can indulge a little bit and some sort of forecasting, when trying to think about how the situation in Ukraine may evolve in the coming months, what kind of scenarios do you envisage, and what kind of implications may a scenario good for Russia and a scenario bad for Russia have for regional and security dynamics in the MENA region? And how do you see, and also more broadly, how do you see the Ukraine war over the medium and long term affecting the relationship between countries in the region and NATO? Yeah, I know.
It's a lot of questions. The last point. On the short term, it's the issue of food and product supply. Food security for many Arab countries and the supply chains. On the long term, assuming that we have some sort of a settlement in the Ukrainian-Russian crisis, probably if the reconstruction efforts of Europe and the Western Hemisphere are going to be directed to rebuilding Ukraine, this could affect assistance that has traditionally been given to the Middle East and the MENA region, and that could raise more complications for social fabrics which have always depended on such grants and reconstruction and aid monies. But I think, again, that the longer the crisis continues, it will be difficult for Middle Eastern countries to continue applying the policy of hedging bets. And I think that then we have to look at each country by itself and the strength of its relations with Russia and with the US. And I believe that there are differences between Arab countries in this context. For instance, if we take from a political point of view the relationship between Egypt and Russia, they are meeting eye to eye on the continuation of the regime of President Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And they are supporting General Haftar in Libya. And in fact, this, if I may say, illicit agreement between the Russians and the Egyptians and obviously other Arab countries in the context of Syria means that Russia's presence in the Middle East region will be enforced and will be given a leading role, because this also brings security issues and stability issues to neighboring countries like Jordan and Egypt and actually Israel. I'm sure that you all yesterday noticed the comment of President Putin that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia needs to be respected in terms of dealing with him. Again, those are political messages showing that there are some sort of political and economic ties behind them. I believe also that, for instance, for Saudi Arabia, the decision of OPEC Plus not to raise oil production is a political message. Of course, it plays in the benefit of Russia. It does not play in the benefit of President Biden, especially in the context of the November So it seems to me that each country has to be taken by its own context in dealing with the implications of the Russian Ukrainian crisis on the Middle East region. But I believe that the sooner that a solution is brought to this crisis, the better will be for all parties.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Javier, you've given us the lowdown on the strategic concept and Madrid, and also a pretty good sense of how the South fits into NATO priorities. Perhaps you can now go to a bit more into specifics and tell us what kind of programs, initiatives NATO can promote to address current challenges in the MENA region, including through cooperation with partners.
Yeah, thank you. So NATO's been working, I would say, pretty well with our southern partners in the last years at different levels. At the bilateral level, I will start with that. We have the political dialogue going on that we have tried to increase as much as it is possible. I was actually in Morocco a couple of days ago. I was in Kuwait 10 days ago, so I've been doing my part in that effort, and I think political dialogue has worked properly with this idea of having a two-way, strict kind of relationship. And as I said before, and the ambassador reiterated that message, the fact that we're looking at our partners as our eyes in the region. To do that, you need to have a high-level conversation with them as regular as possible. Then we have the practical cooperation, of course, and all the tools, the partnership tools that we have to work with our partners. We have plenty of those, training, education, we have all that regards to defense capacity building, a large set of tools that are being used extensively by most of our partners. And then we have the public diplomacy efforts at the bilateral level that are very important, and I will go at the end again to that, since I would agree with Rim very much on this battle of narratives that we are seeing today and how important it is to deal with that. Second, inside NATO, there is also a multilateral effort, and actually the Mediterranean dialogue that is the framework where we are meeting today here in Casa Mediterránea in Alicante is a big part of it. We have two close formats, one with Gulf countries, ICI, Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, that is 18 years old, and the Mediterranean Dialogue, that is 28 years old, and it's been working properly. We need to, of course, make it evolve, adapt those two formats to new realities, make it probably more flexible, try to make it more efficient. That is why, actually, Spain and allies decided to have this meeting yesterday and today in Alicante to think about the way forward on those two formats, in particular on the Mediterranean one here. And third, at the level of international organizations, and that is where I come to the European Union, which is what we say a unique and essential partner, and it is unique and essential. I believe it is, I've been only in office for NATO for a little bit more than a year, but it is clearly in our ADN to work for synergies with international organizations, and in particular with the European Union. We try to be complementary to the action of the European Union. We also try to work with the UN and with regional organizations. I've been meeting in many occasions with the African Union. I was at the UN. We try to also touch upon regional interlocutors, not just bilaterally, but also with regional organizations that have something to say at the local level. We believe very much, I do believe, I am convinced, that at the end what we need to work is on the ownership. I think the times of trying to do our thing wherever we see a problem are gone. I think what we need to do is just to have a two-way straight relationship where we can help you in dealing with some of those challenges and threats, and at the same time we will be benefiting from the work you'll be doing. And I'd like to say just a word on the battle of narratives. I think it is, NATO is actually very respectful of foreign policy choices by our partners and extremely respectful as well with foreign policy choices of our allies. When it comes to our partners, we have been trying in the last months to explain where we are. At the end, it is a simple question to answer. How would you put a stop to the food, energy, and security energy crisis that we're seeing it? And there is only one guy to blame, and we need to be clear on that. The moment Putin puts a stop to the war and withdraw the troops, the moment you will alleviate those two crises, the food crisis and the energy security crisis. That doesn't mean that, of course, we don't understand. I am a career diplomat. I do understand all legitimate foreign policy choices. I do understand balances that every country needs to have. But at the same time, in this particular case, that doesn't mean that a particular country cannot have a relationship if that comes because of cultural, of historical ties, of trade ties, of military procurement ties with Russia. That doesn't mean that. But in terms of what is going on in Europe, we need to be very clear and to look for other explanations to try to find other solutions to the problem. I think it's just deviating the attention to where the pressure should be. Today, the pressure should be on Russia, clearly. Actually, one of the messages that I try to bring to the partners that I know have a relationship and still are connected with Moscow, and as I said, that is completely accepted by NATO, is that they use those channels and that relationship to pass the message, to put some pressure, but also pass the message. The ones that are suffering because of your actions in Ukraine are not just the Europeans or the West. We are also, as partners of Russia, southern partners of Russia, suffering very much from your decisions because of the food security and energy crisis. The more our partners convey that message, the more clear it will be for Russia the need to put a stop of the war. It's not just the West they're harming, it's the world they're harming, and we need to be very clear on that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Javier. Thanks indeed to all three of you. We're now going to open this thing up. We've got about 30 minutes to go. Plenty of expertise in the room, or actually rather in the station, because I don't know if you know that this is an old train station. Magnificent setting. So thanks again to our colleagues from the House of the Mediterranean. Questions, comments. We've got also an online audience, and I don't know if there are any questions already coming in. Yes, there are. Okay, so since there are no questions in the room, let's get going with the online questions.
Yes, let's start with the online audience to break the ice. A question that is directed to any of you that is willing to take it. Is the situation in Libya has worsened, and NATO's intervention is one of the causes of that worsening. Is NATO doing anything to make up for its mistakes?
All right. Thank you for that interesting question. Yes?
Thank you, and thank you to the briefers for the excellent presentations. I have a question to the ambassador and a comment to Rim's briefing. To the ambassador, I would like to ask your opinion about the normalization accords paving the way towards a solution to the Palestinian crisis, to the Palestinian question, according to the UN resolutions, or are we going away from this solution, according to your opinion? I mean, is this a rapprochement going to lead us somewhere, or is it, just for the economic ties to be tightened?
You mean the Abraham's Accords?
Yes.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay, and to Rim, because you spoke about the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean that we all know about, I think that we have to go beyond narratives sometimes, because the situations the Russian invasion to Ukraine was a catalyst for the energy security sector, for instance. We were speaking about diversifying the energy sources even before the war in Ukraine. But after the war in Ukraine, it became obvious that the countries of the region that could be hubs for transporting energy, have more to say, have more mobilized politically, economically, to be able to give alternative solutions for energy. So in this regard, what we share with our partners and the ones who are active in this regard in the region is the way we're going to do it. I mean, according to the principles of international law and practice, this is not exactly an assertiveness of some countries of the region, as you put it. I would say that it is a legitimate right of every country that has something to offer in this regard to be able to follow international law of the sea as well in order to be able to provide alternative solutions for energy for our partners in and our allies in NATO and in the EU. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any more? I think what we're going to do is collect a bunch of questions and then come back to the panel, and then if there's time, we'll go through a second round. Please, gentleman in the back. Please identify yourselves, by the way, if possible, by name and affiliation. No, we can't hear you. Can we perhaps get another mic? Nope.
Maybe, yes.
There you
now,
go.
Yes, okay, good. I'm Mr. Alessandro Reto, I'm from the Italian MOFA. Thank you to the speakers for these very interesting contributions to the general thoughts on the Mediterranean that actually confirms once more how the situation in the region affects heavily Euro-Atlantic security. You touched rightly all the main hotspots of instability in the region, Northern Africa, Middle East. I would just like add another very, very concerning hotspot that is the Sahel, because when you mention Russian presence in the region, we should also pay increasing attention to the state support towards private military companies that plays a major role as a source of instability. We saw Russia as a kind of vertical threat stemming from the Central African Republic to Mali, to Burkina Faso, Gulf of Guinea, because unfortunately the instability in Sahel is producing spillover effects also in the bordering countries. So just a general remark on the important attention on the Sahel, and I would like to suggest a question in terms of what kind of potential role NATO could play in Sahel in trying to give its contribution to address this source of instability. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes, well, let's take two more, and then we'll come back. Otherwise, it's going to be too many to remember. We've got a gentleman here on the second row. Okay, you just go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Good morning. My name is Ava Leone. I'm with the U.S. delegation to NATO in Brussels. I wanted to explore a little bit more something that the Deputy Assistant Secretary General said about these countries that both of you described, Ambassador Narim, as sitting on the fence. DASG Colomina talked about this idea that we'd like to encourage them not to stay on the fence about something which very directly, negatively impacts most of them. Can you speak a bit to what extent these countries are engaging either bilaterally with Russia, using their positive and open relationship some of them have, to say that this is affecting us, we need you to stop, because we all know that this is a war that President Putin started and can stop the moment he wishes, or ideally, as a group approaching. So to what extent is this happening already, and what are the obstacles that maybe prevent countries from being a bit more forward-leaning and leveraging the relationships that they maintain to push for an end to this war? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And we've got one more. Let's take one more. You've got it? Yeah. Yes.
Bonjour. Hello. Now that we have solved this cyber attack on my mic, I have a question on the potential for stability through the development of renewable energies in the Mediterranean and the potential role of the European Union in that? Thank you.
Sorry, potential for stability, but what?
For development of renewable energies.
Renewable energies.
Yeah.
Renewable
Renewable
energies.
energy. Ouch, sorry. Okay, great, thanks. That's quite a bit for us to chew on. We will have a second round if there's time. We're going to come back to the panel. Let me just briefly recap. There's a question, I guess, for all of you. To what extent is NATO to blame for instability in the region? There's a question for the ambassador on the Palestinian issue. A question / comment for Rim on the Eastern Mediterranean situation. Then one for Javier, I guess, on the Sahel, if you can elaborate a bit more on what NATO can do in the area. Another one for the ambassador, what about, getting some of the countries off the fence? And then finally a question on renewable energy and the potential for that. In fact, that's a very timely question. There was recently, as you know, an agreement at EU level on that, and there will be a follow-on meeting here in Alicante, I understand, next month between Spain, Portugal, and France that is linked to this file. So let's stick to the order, to the speaking order. Javier, why don't we start with you, then the ambassador, then Rim.
Okay, so I will take first the Sahelian question. I think it's quite recent. We've moved quite a lot on a file that wasn't at the table of the North Atlantic Council only 2 years ago. But we've moved from very specific principles that we have decided to give ourselves. Complementarity, added value, demand-driven. If you take all of them together and you see the multiplicity of actors that you can see in the Sahel, the action of NATO will be necessarily limited. You need to also take into account that the only Sahelian partner that NATO has is Mauritania. That doesn't mean that we cannot interact with the other actors in the region, and we can do that, but in a more limited fashion, since they won't have access on a generic basis to the partnership menu of activities that we do have. So I think it was already a breakthrough that we were able, in particular in the circumstances that we are right now since February 24, that we were able to establish the relation we have with Mauritania and to launch the defense capacity building package that we launched in Madrid. And when I was myself in Mauritania before the summit, and speaking with the Mauritanian president, we were actually looking at something a bit larger, if possible, than the actual bilateral relationship with Mauritania within that DCP package, which is actually to open a window to the G5 Sahel. And it's just to open a window that probably right now we won't be able to use, but since the secretariat of the G5 Sahel is in Nouakchott, Defense College of the G5 Sahel is also in Nouakchott, we could start exploring avenues to work with those countries through their own secretariat. We'll see how we do that. Now we need to implement those decisions. We have a clear mandate from our leaders. Now we need, as IS, to decide how we implement that DCP package. It is our intention to probably place a bunch of people, a very limited cell of coordinating people in Nouakchott to help implement the DCP package, to have a better understanding of what is going on in the Sahel, and then see what we could do with the G5. It is my conviction that actually I shared with the Mauritanian president, and it was the same feeling that the G5 Sahel is now in an extreme fragile situation, but we just need to see the glass half full and not half empty, try to leverage as much as we can, even if it's very fragile, that sub-regional institution, try to get Mali again inside of it, and try to use it since it was a creation by those partners, and therefore we should continue to support ownership. And I think I would stop that with that question. Maybe they can go with their own questions and then take the generic ones altogether.
Sure,
yeah.
Sure. Ambassador.
Thank you. The question on the Abraham Accords, I would like to start by saying that, as my colleague, Mr. Khafir, said, each country should be respected for its foreign policy choices. So I do respect the foreign policy choices of the GCC countries which decided to get with Israel into the Abraham Accords. However, the issue is that the Abraham Accords have overlooked the cornerstone of the Arab Peace Initiative and the cornerstone of peace between Arabs and Israelis, and that is peace for land. So today we're talking about normalization for normalization. But what kind of normalization? Palestinians continue to suffer, and the Abraham Accords did not contemplate or encompass solidly and clearly that there will be a Palestinian state on Palestinian soil. And there I believe that there is an issue. However, if such an accord would push forward with bringing peace closer, it is welcome. But from my own perspective, I do not see them more than economic ties or economic cooperation, and I do not see that this will bring peace closer to the region. I would like to link this to the issue of putting pressure on Putin from Arab countries in order to end the crisis. But probably, and I'm saying this within this context of NATO, that this is also a good opportunity for Western Hemisphere countries to put pressure on Israel to find a proper solution to the Palestinian issue. And by doing this, probably going back to the question of my colleague, the lady from the foreign minister, from the Secretary State Department, that this could also be a way by putting pressure on Israel and also by using the US leverage in this context, that some Arab countries who are sitting on the fence in the Ukrainian crisis could get off the fence because they've seen, or they are seeing, that one of the issues that they've been always calling for is being tackled in a way that takes into consideration their political and security and social interests in the region. So if we manage to do this, and maybe this is a good chance to do it, to place such a pressure, then we will see a different dynamic in the region from Arab countries like Jordan and like Egypt and like Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis the Ukrainian crisis. Again, my message to you that with this conflict that is going on in the backyard of Europe, the security and political and occupation problems in the Middle East should not be ignored. If it is ignored, it's going to be escalated and it's going to come back and haunt us all. So that is my message to this audience. I have just, actually, this is part of the thing that I used to do when I was Secretary General for the Union for the Mediterranean Renewable Energy. You know, these are the big projects that we need in the region. And today, Europe is facing for the first time gas shortages. And if we applied properly the UFM, which has been now for 10 years there, for instance, because we have a major section there, or you know, part of the UFM is the energy thing. You have the southern rim of the Mediterranean, vast deserts. This could have been a big project for the southern rim of the Mediterranean, the Arab countries from Morocco to Syria, and also for Europe. And when we have a crisis such as the crisis that we have today, and we have shortage of gas supplies coming from Russia, affecting Europe and affecting all of you in Europe, if we had a plan B with the Mediterranean countries, having renewable and good and clean energy coming from the south, probably Europe and NATO would have been in a better political positioning vis-à-vis Russia?
Thank you, Ambassador. Rim.
Thanks. I will start perhaps by the question that came in online about NATO and Libya. I guess it's just important to remind the person who asked the question, might be a good opportunity to go back and pull up UN Security Council Resolution 1973 and read how many times the League of Arab States is mentioned in the resolution. And understand that when you look at the votes, the representative of the League of Arab States, Lebanon at the time, so on consensus by the League of Arab States, supported the resolution that led to that intervention. And so were the African representatives on the Security Council. There is no doubt that the aftermath and the day after that intervention has not been well dealt with, and it has led to extreme instability in the region. First and foremost, the destruction of, well, it's not the destruction, but perhaps instability in Libya, a country where its former dictator, Gaddafi, never took the trouble to even build institutions. So that has to be kept in mind. It was very hard to build these institutions very quickly in the aftermath of his fall. And there's no doubt that the aftermath of that intervention has not been dealt with well. And part of that responsibility lies with neighboring countries and Arab states. There is no question about that, in addition to the Western states that intervened militarily. When it comes to renewable energy, of course, this is always perhaps a source of possible optimism or hope in a region that sometimes lacks hope and optimism. But if we look at the details of renewable energy, you need an integrated region in order to harness those renewable energies and then be able to send them across the Mediterranean. So when you're talking about solar energy, if you're talking about wind energy, but also hydrogen, which is green energy, not renewable, you need to be able to, first of all, capture the solar energy, let's say, and then store it, and then send it on its way around the southern rim, but also towards the north and in Europe. And unfortunately, the region is very far, far away from that. When it comes to just economic ties, it's not integrated enough. And so these big infrastructure projects need much more integration and much more cooperation between the countries, which just brings me to the comment by Greece. I mean, I'm glad to hear that from your perspective, it's not a question of assertive behavior. So, I mean, that's an interesting data point. I wish it was as simple as just applying international law. It seems not to be the case, because if it were, I guess there wouldn't be this problem. I mean, I guess international law is up for interpretation still. So I hope it becomes as simple as you put it. And I think that's all that was directed at me.
Thank you, Rim. Javier, I think you wanted to come back to some of the...
Well, I just wanted to add to the... I knew Rim was going to answer very well the Libyan question. It is part of the narrative we hear. I do hear when I travel into the region. So that was very well explained. But I just wanted to add that NATO is been ready for quite a while already to step up and cooperate with Libyan authorities. We have a DCB sort of cooperation, defense capacity building. It's not a package, but it is a sort of actions that we have approved. But we're just waiting for the proper government stability to be able to help Libyan authorities. Right now, there's just not a clear interlocutor, but we've been thinking about Libya quite a lot. We know, as Rim was saying, that the aftermath of what happened in 2011 has been handled, well, maybe not in the most efficient way. It was a very difficult scenario. I think there is plenty of people to blame, generically the international community, I would say. NATO is just an actor of it, is an easy target in many occasions. But as she said, I think we were just part of the decisions that were taken at the time. And right now, we are ready to be part of the solution whenever Libya gets to decide on their own internal political process. So I just wanted to reassure the audience that it is part of our considerations, that we already took decisions in that sense, and we will just implement those when, as we often say, conditions will be the proper ones. Yeah, that's all.
Excellent, thank you. So we've got 7 minutes to go. Are there any burning questions from your side? No? Okay, so if there aren't, I'm just going to ask one final question for our speakers. We're going to go in the reverse order and close with Javier. So I'll give you 2 minutes each to address my question and then any final issues that you may want to tackle. It's interesting that we didn't mention China once, and that's interesting for me because it seems to be structuring most of the conversations we have about international security and geopolitics recently. So
I did.
You did, perhaps mention it, but I'd like you to elaborate a bit more. How do you see China's role in the region evolving? And
Thank you for that question. Obviously, oh, sorry, Javier.
Go for it.
Obviously, China is present in the region. It is present through the Digital Silk Road and through the Belt and Road Initiative. It is expanding its ties, whether it's trade ties or other, with different parts of the region. And it obviously has ambitions. It sees how important, just from an economic perspective, but also as it asserts itself as a real global power, the importance of the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is one of the most important connecting bodies of water in the world, especially for chains of production, and we've seen how those were disrupted during COVID. So everyone has a vested interest now to be part of these seas that have become sort of the backbone of the international economy. So this is what China is doing so far. It doesn't compare at this stage with the threat and challenge that Russia poses, because it hasn't expanded as much into the various different, hard power influence that is directed against, very clearly directed against certain interests. Italy brought up the Sahel. Of course, we know how much Russian influence has been used in order to attack France in particular. So China isn't behaving that way. But on that, I would like to say one thing, perhaps to the audience also outside of this room. China is obviously a rising partner and player in the region, and Russia continues to establish itself. Isn't it interesting that Russia and China don't figure at all in the top 5 purveyors of international aid to countries in MENA? When COVID hit, the vaccines that worked were vaccines that weren't the Chinese, neither the Russian vaccine. When there are natural disasters, it is still, unfortunately, the European countries and the US that pays the biggest part of the aid. And perhaps China and Russia, as they assert themselves, will want to contribute more to that as well. Thank you.
Good point. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
I would like to actually add to what Reem just said. Indeed, China has a very important presence in the Middle East and in the Arab region, and it's mainly based on economic bridges, selling commodities, Chinese technology and Chinese commodities, and economic relations. But I want to stress that I do believe that indeed China is not posing, if we may say, any threats, although the economic threat should be also considered threat, especially to the United States and other countries in the Western Hemisphere. But I do believe that, and of course there's no comparison between what Russia has done so far and China, but more or less maybe they should be put in the same context or same plate in the overall world context. I believe that there is a confrontation that is being, or a divide that is being forged. And that is not the traditional divide that we had it between the West and the East. I'm not sure, most likely, some scholars say that the unipolar system is over and now we have a maybe multipolar system, but I think that the divide is going to be within capitalism itself, probably between democratic capitalism and authoritarian capitalism. Probably we need to think about this kind of divide in the future. Maybe we need to think more about the human rights issues, democracies, and international law issues. Maybe these are the elements that we have to consider in this coming divide. And this should be taken in the context of when we address Russia and China, whether in the Middle East region or worldwide.
Thanks, Ambassador. Happy that you ended on such a big picture note on types of capitalism and polarity. That's very, very refreshing. Javier.
Yeah, so I do think they don't belong to the same plate, but they do belong to the same framework of strategic competition that we're facing. Clearly, the relationship we have with Russia could be just defined on adversarial terms. It's as an aggressor, it is an invader, it's an adversary. China is a different thing, completely different thing, and we look at China with different eyes. It is a systemic challenge for NATO, but at the same time is an actor that we're looking to have to engage in global conversations. In the case of NATO, basically on arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation issues, but also climate change and security. Other actors would probably, or for sure, engage China on global governance or other issues. On how do I see China relating with MENA countries? It is clearly, as the ambassador was saying, an increasing actor. It is increasing in economic terms, but that doesn't mean that it will stop there. That doesn't mean that it's not part of that geostrategic competition that I was saying. And actually, I will use something that the ambassador said on Russia. He said about the European countries, if we had a plan B on renewable energies, if we had a plan B on network connections with the South, probably we wouldn't be facing the problems we're facing today with Russia. So actually my question to my very good friends from southern nations is, do you have a plan B when China comes with a hard hand, and it will probably come at some point, when you're relating with, on them very much on economic and trading issues? And I do understand that sometimes there is an alternative, and money comes from it comes. It's very clear in some countries. But we all need to think about that. We do think about what could be that alternative and probably provide that alternative to you. But I think it's important that our partners also think about that, not just in what it is the immediate term. We need the loans and we need the money and we need the investments, but also in what could come in a few years' time.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. So it is now 12:30. I think that this was a fascinating discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you for your great questions. I'm not going to try to summarize lots of takeaways. Perhaps we can follow up over lunch. But please do join me in thanking our wonderful speakers and our hosts for this great session. Thank you.